Hello everyone, welcome back to another video on comparing Python and Ruby syntax. In today's video, we're going to be talking about control flow, and by control flow, I'm referring to if, else, and while blocks. So we're going to be talking about logical operations and conditional statements. So let's say you had a number, let's say 10, and in Python, to create an if statement, we simply type if, and let's say we wanted to check to see if this number is positive. We'll say if x is greater than 0, print x is positive. In Ruby, if we convert it to Python to Ruby, we see that it looks very similar, except we don't have this colon here that we have in Python, and instead of this colon, we have to add an end block to signify the end of this block. And so we run this. Oops. We copy and paste this and run it in the Ruby compiler. We see that we get x is positive. So we can also add another if block, and instead of we'll say x is negative if x is less than 0. So we convert that. You see that we have two separate if blocks, just like we do in Python. In Ruby, you can tell they're two separate if blocks because of this end keyword signifying the end of this block. Now the thing here is that if x is greater than 0, this condition will run. Otherwise, this condition runs, right? If it's less than 0. So if this were to run, the first condition, the second one will never run. So in program, we usually, instead of doing two if statements like so, we would use an else if statement. In Python, this is called elif. And if we convert it to Ruby, it's called else if. And you notice that before we had two end keywords, but now we only have one, because now this is part of the same if else chain. Before they were two separate blocks, now they're the same block. So that's why you only have one end keyword. And we can also add an else and say print x is 0. And you see we get if, else if, and else, and then we get the end block. So we copy and paste this. You see that x is positive because x is 10, and if I changed it to negative 10, we get x is negative, and then if we change it to 0, we get x is 0. Okay, so another thing we could do is we can have more than one condition. So this is a single condition, right? It's just checking to see if the number is positive. So another condition we can check for is if x is, let's say, even. So if x mod 2 is equal to 0 and x is greater than 0, we'll say x is even and positive. And if we convert it to Ruby, you see that instead of having this and keyword, we have this double ampersand. And this double ampersand is the same as and in Python. So if I take this, and please excuse the noise in the background, we get x is even and positive. And in Ruby, we can also use this and keyword, and we get the same result, x is even and positive. Why is that? Why don't we just use the and keyword instead of the double ampersand? Well, let's say we were to print true and false. So if we do that, we get false, right? Because true and false evaluates to false. What happens if we change this to and, true and false? We should expect the same thing, right? False. So let's run it. And we get some type of error. So in Ruby, there's a difference in precedence, and the double ampersand has a higher precedence than the and keyword. So what we're seeing here is this print has this parentheses, and it's trying to print before it evaluates what's inside it. So what's happening is it's trying to call print and then call true and false. Whereas if we change this to and, the double ampersand is saying evaluate this first and then print it. So with the and, it's doing the other way around. So it's printing first and then evaluating. So what if we just took away the parentheses then? And then we run it. We don't have an error this time, but it's evaluating something unexpected. We're expecting false, right? Because true and false gives us false. Well, it turns out we also have another precedence error, and that is with the print statement. Even without the parentheses, the print statement still takes higher precedence. So what we're actually doing is we're doing print true and false. So when we run this, we get true for both outputs. This print true is happening first, and then unlike Python, when you print or assign, it returns a Boolean value. So in this case, this print true returns true, and in Python this does not happen, so you get like some type of syntax error. But in Ruby, we're printing true, which is why you see true as the output, and then this will return true, and it results in this, true and false. Since we're not doing anything with this value, it's just going to just be created and not be assigned to anything. It's a legal operation, but it does nothing. So that's the reason why instead of using the AND keyword, you want to use the double ampersand. And the same applies for OR. So in Ruby, you can also do OR statements, which is true or false, which also evaluates to true. You can also do it with the OR keyword. In this case, it evaluates to true because we'll always have at least one true, then true or anything will always result in true. So one more thing, we have negation, and if you want to negate in Ruby, in Python, let's say you want to do print not true. Oops. In Ruby, it's the exclamation mark, not. So you get false. And this is a common structure in C++, Java. In C++, you get the same precedence issue, and I guess you just carry it over with Ruby, and that is AND has a lower precedence than the double ampersand, or has a lower precedence than the double vertical bars, and negation, you just have this exclamation mark. Okay, so it's basically the same in C++. What else? Okay, so that's the if condition. And what about while loop? While loop, it's pretty simple. It's the same thing, except you're repeating the condition over and over again. So let's say you have x equals 0, and while x is less than 5, we'll print x, and then we'll increment x. And never forget to increment, otherwise x will always be 0 and you're stuck in an infinite loop. So if I convert this to Ruby, we get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Because it starts at 0, we print it, then we increment it, and this condition gets repeated over and over. Okay, so that's the basics of if, else if, else, and while loops. What about with a list? So let's say you have a list and the values are 50, oops, wrong one, list, and the values are 50, 2, 17, 3, 9, and you want to check to see if a number is in the list. And so we'll say if 50 in the list, print 50 is in the list. And then in Ruby, the syntax is quite different. Instead of saying 50 in list, we say list.include with a question mark and then the value, so 50. So we took this, you see 50 is in the list. So instead of 50, why don't we change it to 5? And then you see nothing gets printed because 5 is not in the list. And what about while loop then? Maybe with while loop we can say something like while the length of the list is greater than 2, just pop from the list. So currently the length of the list is 5, so we're just going to pop from the end of the list until we get a size of 2. So I'm going to print the list, before and print the list after. I take this, go to Ruby, and you see 52, 17, 3, 9, and then after we do this while loop, we pop all the values until we get a size of 2, and then we print that and we get a size of 2 here, 50 and 2. So yeah, that's it for control flow with Python and Ruby. See you in the next video.